Is Christianity a cargo cult? These are my thoughts and opinions. My thoughts are worth precisely what you paid for them, and my opinions, as always, are freely given. Please let me know what you think. There is a popular view of cargo cults, which is of ignorant and superstitious Pacific Islanders after World War II, mimicking the technology and routines of US servicemen, doing such things as making wooden aircraft and marching up and down with wooden rifles, in the belief that by doing so the cargo, which fell from the sky whilst the islands were occupied, would magically return. Well, yes, they did do that, but the story is more complex. The term cargo cult was coined in 1945, but the cargo cult practice predates that. But first, I'd like to say a couple of things. It is well reported that the Spanish were welcomed as gods by the Native Americans, and it's not hard to imagine why. Partly, of course, it is the Clark adage concerning advanced technology being indistinguishable from magic, but I like to imagine the scene on some Peruvian beach as the huge Spanish ships advanced, their sails high above the horizon shining white in the morning sun. The chief of the tribe turns to his wise man, who neglected to mention this dramatic turn of events in the weekly prophecy meeting, and says, "Hey, Watsy Wattle, what's that?" Watsy Wattle, whose name literally translates as thinks fast and talks faster, replies, "It is the gods returning as foretold in the story of the jaguar and the wide-mouthed frog. I have suspected for some time, with Jupiter being in alignment with Mars and the biting spiders being particularly bitey this month. But I didn't want to put the kibosh on it by telling anyone." And would it be much different today if a huge alien spacecraft suddenly moved into orbit around the Earth? Alex Jones would blame the Illuminati. Paul Begley would tell us St. Peter was on board. The more sober religious leaders would be scrabbling through their scriptures to see how they could spin the occasion to prove that their holy text was the only one which prophesied the event. And the rest of us would, I assume, be in some measure of awe and wonder at such an advanced technological feat. At least those of us not living in the USA, where building bunkers and stockpiling food and hollow point ammunition would be the order of the day. This awe and wonder aspect is an important part of the cargo cult. Once you get over the shock of aliens arriving with unimaginable and exotic technology, you might find yourself wanting a piece of it. Aspiration is a very human thing. Every marketing woman and salesman knows about the power of aspiration. They don't sell products, they sell aspiration. They convince the gullible public that if they buy product X, which all the rich and successful people use, that they themselves will somehow magically become rich and successful. Of course, by buying product X, which they cannot afford, and which is sold by a company whose shares are all owned by the rich and successful, they actually ensure not only that they will never become rich, but also that the divide between themselves and those that are will only ever widen. Superstition also plays a part in the cargo cult. We're all superstitious. However much we try to reason ourselves out of it, I would doubt there is one of us who does not occasionally catch themselves thinking of a lucky number or fleetingly considering karma before perhaps mentally reeling ourselves in. We know that the Pacific Islanders had a well-developed mythology prior to contact with the Europeans. Ancestor worship played a big part. They communed with the spirits of the dead, and they had their gods who imbued certain people with supernatural powers, enabling them to be successful in warfare. Starting in the late 18th century, missionaries appeared amongst the islanders in impressive ships, bringing advanced tools, equipment, and written books full of magical words, promising to teach the natives the Western ways and technologies and introducing them to a new god, who must, on the evidence presented, be so much more powerful than their own. The missionaries also introduced Jesus' imminent return and an idyllic heaven into the natives' superstitions. Colonization quickly followed. Commerce, of course, was the driving force. The natives found their old way of life disappear as they were employed in harvesting not only their native crops, but also new crops introduced by the European factories, only to see all of them disappear over the horizon to who knows where. In a single generation, islands which had been literally in the Stone Age, in a subsistence economy, found themselves subjugated by immensely powerful aliens who imposed upon them new religions, new laws, new morals, all with the promise of great rewards, which of course never arrived. A combination of culture shock, the mingling of Christianity with their own rich mythology, and their desire to emulate, and in some cases expel, the European colonial powers is what led to the first recognised cargo cult. I should lastly mention that the primitive societies had a view of history as episodic rather than evolutionary. That is to say that history for them was not viewed as a series of interconnected events, each leading from one to another. Instead, change was always dramatic, often with a chaotic interlude. Prophecies would state that dramatic change would occur after some event or sign. Read any mythology and you will see this pattern. Hesiod, writing around 700 BC, talked of the 5 ages of man. The Old Testament is an obvious episodic history, just as the New Testament revelation is a clear episodic prophecy. The first cargo cult is considered to be what is now known as the VAILALA madness, which began in late 1919 and lasted just a few years. VAILALA in Papua New Guinea was suffering the joint blessings of evangelism and colonialism, both of which had been sold to the locals with grand promises of a bright future. Where the alien invaders were not warmly welcomed, it became obvious that resistance was futile, so the natives complied more or less willingly, but the promise was never fulfilled. And so, from their native superstitions combined with the imported Christianity, a new mythology was developed. Powerless to confront the colonial powers directly, they determined that the reason for their lack of prosperity was their own failure to correctly apply the lessons they had learned. The result in the case of Valala appeared to the casual observer to be contagious insanity. As the acting resident magistrate G.H. Murray wrote at the time, Mr. X visited the government station on the evening of the 9th of September to report extraordinary conduct on the part of the natives from Kiru to Vailala. According to him, the natives were saying that the spirits of their ancestors had appeared to several in the villages and told them that all flour, rice, tobacco and other trade belonged to the New Guinea people and that the white man had no right whatever to these goods. In a short time all the white men were to be driven away and then everything would be in the hands of the natives. A large ship was also shortly to appear, bringing back the spirits of the departed relatives with quantities of cargo, and all the villagers were to make ready to receive them. Platforms were being erected in the villages, and these were being loaded up with presents. Bosses, or big men, were appointed, presumably self-appointed, who seemed to be acting as masters of ceremony in these preparations, and making the other natives fall in with a pretense of drilling them and making them salute. Another interesting quote from F.E. Williams, the assistant government anthropologist, describing the actions of a young man who was angry at Williams and others' intrusion into their cult house. He heaved long sighs and looked genuinely distracted. Finally he moved across to the flagpole and stamped round and round it, shouting such phrases as, "Hurry up! What's the matter? Come on, boy!" This repetition of haranguing phrases will be familiar to any parent who has caught their child playing with dolls and repeating verbatim the phrases the parent themselves use, perhaps way too often, to chastise the child. Perhaps the child in their innocence is playing the same game that the Papuans were. They are trying to please, but are being repeatedly berated by their parent, and this role play allows them to exercise power in a world where they are otherwise impotent. So the anatomy of a cargo cult appears to be a people feeling oppressed or overwhelmed by their situation and wanting dramatic change, imposing upon themselves ritualistic behaviour which may well be demeaning to them in the short term, in the hope that the rituals will initiate a dramatic change in the world and bring about a time of milk and honey. A cargo cult carefully considered is not so bizarre, but rather a very human reaction to a specific set of circumstances. Think of the period of the Babylonian captivity, which was when the Pentateuch took form, or the Roman occupation of Jerusalem when the New Testament took form. Do they not represent circumstances of a powerless, superstitious people, desperate for change? But let us get more basic. Think about life in general. And I'm not talking about human life. Life is a struggle. That, after all, is the basis of evolutionary theory. Once a creature is born, it has to struggle to survive long enough to become independent, with the odds stacked very much against it. Once out on its own, life becomes a daily round of finding food to eat, whilst avoiding becoming someone else's meal. And that is life, day in and day out, for as long as you are fortunate enough if fortunate is the right word, to live. We humans are animals. For most of our history, our lot in life, for the vast majority of us, has been no better than for any other animal. For many, little has changed today. We were born with a 50-50 chance of surviving the event, and about the same odds of reaching the age of reproduction, at which point our lives became a daily round of finding food and fending off predators, the worst of which were other humans, with estimates of 60% of primitive adults dying in some kind of combat. For most of us today, these primitive threats have receded, but we are genetically programmed to react to threats, and our brains are quick to detect them and dump chemicals into our systems to help us deal with them. It does not matter whether we are being stalked by a lion or dumped on at work. Our bodies are not intelligently designed to differentiate. We have a simple fight or flight response. Our body jacks us up on mainline pharmaceuticals in preparation for our response. Were it a lion, then the act of running away very, very quickly would consume the excess hormones which would otherwise adversely affect us. If we stood our ground, then the lion would consume the excess hormones and they would no longer be our concern. Today there is no lion, just the office boar, and if we resist the urge to fight or flight, then the chemicals dumped into our system to aid us will now poison us. In short, the symptoms of stress are largely due to you not being eaten by that lion. We all suffer stresses, and I'm sure that most of us have reflected on how absurd it is to stress about some of the things that we do. Understanding how we are programmed to become so easily stressed should help us understand why for some people the stress, with no means to relieve the cause, quickly becomes overwhelming. In short, I would contest, life in general for many people is a culture shock. They feel overwhelmed by it. And I have not mentioned the contemplation of death and the eternal nothingness, which again we all, I am sure, occasionally at least, ponder. So whilst we may feel civilised, cosseted and comfortable, far apart from the primitive Pacific Islanders, we are all at risk of joining a cargo cult. If we feel threatened by our inability to control aspects of our lives and overwhelmed by the idea of death, then we might look to a drastic solution in the supernatural. Look to the priests and preachers who claim to have the answers. Look to the supernatural myths they present and mimic the actions of the heroes therein. Mutilate our genitals because that is what they did. Sing the hymns, partake in the rituals, harangue ourselves continually, doing everything in our power to convince ourselves that just over the horizon is Christ in his cargo ship and he is coming for us.